So this morning we continue on. We're in this We Are Gathered Here series, and we're going to begin today by looking at rhythms. We're going to look at our rhythm of why we gather. And so I want to talk about one of my personal habits, and I have this habit that many of you probably have too, that I make sure every morning to get up a little bit earlier than what I have to be in order to make that delicious dark beverage that we have out here every Sunday, right? Every day I have to get up and have my coffee fixed. It's just kind of what I do. And I make sure that if I really need to be up at 6 o'clock, then I'm up at 5:30 because I like to sit at the table. And as I've gotten older, I've already talked about that, I like to put my hands on that nice warm mug and enjoy a little bit of downtime with that delicious cup of coffee. And just recently, I had a day where I didn't get my coffee fix in the morning. I didn't get up in time, and I went till 10 a.m. without having coffee, which some of you are like, that's nonsense. But for me, that was a really bad day because something happened that I hadn't experienced quite yet in my life. I had a headache, and even though I tried to play catch up, I couldn't. I had a nagging headache that entire day. I could never quite catch up to what I needed. So it's pretty clear at this point in my life that I have a caffeine need by now. I might have to deal with that, but I'm not dealing with that yet. But it really has become for me, this coffee thing, a habit. It's a part of my daily routine. It's a rhythm, frankly, of my best operation. And so this morning I want to, as we engage with this topic a little bit, I want you to just take a moment and think about some of the habits that you have. Let them come to your mind really quick. And maybe think about one, if you can narrow it down, the first one that really pops up. Just give me a second. And as you think about that, it's likely maybe you went to a habit in your mind that is not the best habit. Often it seems a lot of times we'll think of maybe a habit that isn't our best one. I don't want to call them bad habits because it's not necessarily bad. It's just, yeah, that's a habit I should probably deal with. But it just seems we go there a lot. But we also have very good habits, and I hope that maybe some of you you're the optimistic, I can't talk about that. You guys are the ones that are positive about things, and maybe you went there too, because we all have good habits as well. And the truth is, our habits are actually much more deeply ingrained in us than some of us would think. You're going to see a quote here. This is out of an article I was reading about habits and rhythms. And you'll see this quote up here on the screen. Follow along. It says this. It says, habits are our brain's way of increasing its efficiency. Our brain turns daily actions and behaviors into habits. So we would do them automatically and without too much thought, thus freeing up our brain power for other more important challenges. This strategy of our brain has wonderful benefits for us. It allows us to function better in life. It goes on to say, just imagine if you had to consider and ponder every single task or reaction. You'd be exhausted. Now, I know some of you, and I think some of you do try to manage and ponder every single task, and I usually hear a little bit of exasperation, because that's an exhausting thing. See, good or bad, right or wrong, habits are powerful. And with this insight in mind about habits, I want to offer you one more to consider. That habits follow cravings, because habits seek rewards. So for instance, and this is a pretty relatable one, at least if you're anything like me, if you really want to stop that habit of snacking right before bedtime, having that bowl of ice cream, oh man, isn't ice cream's the best. Ice cream's the best. If you really want to stop that habit, and the thing is, but you don't address the cravings and then the rewards that you feel and you get contributing to that habit, then you are going to have an incredibly difficult time stopping those late night ice cream runs. It is carb loading for the next day, says Bruce, who is lifting massive weights. We don't all live that life, Bruce, but yes, it's true. So likewise, as we desire to create new habits, these new good things that we believe would be better habits, we need to address the underlying cravings and the rewards that also contribute to them. So, since we're at church, right, we're gathering together in this space, we're gathering together online for worship. I have a few pointed questions for you to consider as we dive into our main topic. I wonder, Do you crave healthy, God-honoring relationships with others? Do you earnestly desire a consistent and a powerful life of prayer and of stillness? Are you hungry for a deeper experience, or what I might call a truer knowing of Jesus and his teachings? And how could a rhythm of gathering together in fellowship with other believers help each of us develop the habits of faith and a true sense of belonging that I know we all crave and have been craving for so long in our lives? See, the early church knew something about gathering together. And we discussed this a little bit back when we went through the book of Acts together. But they knew something about gathering together. And the truth is, our churches and faith communities have been modeling themselves after their example for hundreds of years. In Acts 2:42, which I know is a very familiar passage, highlights several things that they were specifically devoted to doing whenever they gathered together. And so you can check this out with me. We're going to read this, follow along. It says this in Acts 2:42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. So 4 things right there, right, that they were devoted to specifically. It comes in one verse, which I like that. Luke, the author, to the point. Boom, get right at it. So if you see it right there, teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. These are the rewards, if you will, of a healthy rhythm, a habit of gathering together with other believers. And the early church was fully devoted to this because they were the kind of all-in participants that we've been talking about since, I guess, like almost 2 years ago when I started speaking on a more regular basis. We've been talking about this for a while, about all-in participation. And in fact, the author Luke, as I've already mentioned, tells us even a few more details a few verses later, and now in Acts 2:46 and the beginning of 47. He says this, every day they, these early church believers, continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. These believers were unwavering in their commitment to gather together. And in a similar way, I want us to think about something that each of us, think about this just with you. I'm asking you to really ponder things for yourself a little bit today. That will keep coming up. But I want us to think about something that each of us is absolutely committed to doing every day in your life. I use the goofy example of drinking coffee. It's not exactly where we're going now. But think of something that has become such a deeply ingrained habit that it is simply just part of who you are. Because this is what a consistent rhythm will do in your life. It becomes the habits that are a central piece to becoming who you are. And when we ponder that, the challenge now is to consider, is that habit of yours actually helping you become the most real you, who you were actually created to be and what you were created to do? Is it producing in you the type of rewards and benefits that you want? Because the truth is, if it isn't helping, if it isn't rewarding, you have to ask yourself, can you learn a different way? How many of you out here, and you can just raise hands and online, you could comment in the online portion there if you'd like to, how many of you enjoy learning? And along with that, and you can keep your hand, you can raise it back up, do you consider yourself a lifelong learner? We'll see who's really participating, because some of you I know are very much learners. Okay? Lifelong learners. You know, it's the idea that you just enjoy new understandings, new approaches. You like solving problems. And if you're a problem solver, you're my kind of person, because I can't stand problems. Where's Devin somewhere out there? Rubik's Cube man, like stuff like that rattles my brain. Not my thing. You see, the reward of good teaching, is also good learning. And learning together with other believers was something that the early church was absolutely devoted to. See, they knew, and we do too, right, that learning takes time. And it can be difficult because learning requires our effort. Learning requires our attention, and maybe worst of all, learning requires a willingness to be corrected, to learn something new, change what you may have all thought it was. But the reward is great because the reward for such a good rhythm of learning is a closer connection along with a deeper understanding and a deeper knowledge. So hear me out on this, because I'm sure there aren't many of us here in this room, followers of Christ, that would say, and when I say, I mean like verbalize, like out loud. You wouldn't say things like, I don't want a deeper understanding of Scripture. I don't want a deeper understanding of my faith. I don't want a deeper connection to God and to others. But unfortunately, I do know many followers of Christ that act as though they already have all the answers they need. And they seem to almost put their fingers in their ears, and they act just like what I've talked about in the past, like little Henry that used to go around saying, I ain't doing no learning. Ain't doing no learning. And the reason why I know this to be true is not to throw shade at anyone. It's because guess what? I am guilty of that attitude also. Because what you and I know is that understanding and learning, it never ends. And guess what? It's exhausting. But this isn't the way of, ain't doing no learning is not the way to develop a good rhythm of continually learning as you and I continue to follow Jesus. So we must ask, are we, meaning if you're a believer, especially longtime believers, are we open to the much more that God has for us? Or are each of us only brave enough to cling tightly to what we already know? Because I dare say this, and I found it to be true. If we are willing, God and His Spirit are not done teaching us. And the flip side of that, too, is that God and His Spirit are not done helping us unlearn some of the things that we need to unlearn. But as we called for a daily decision here over these last couple weeks, each of us has a decision to make on this. Are we opened up to learning, or are we just closed off to anything new? The early church placed a really high emphasis on gathering with each other. And we discussed this more in detail last week, so I won't belabor this too much. But this focus was with a group of people that were like-minded, and they had this similar conviction that the way of Jesus was the only true way to find an abundant and freeing life. And they were aligned with one another in a singular belief in the resurrection of Jesus, which demonstrated a power over evil and a power over death. And they came together on the regular to prepare to go out and be the saltiest salt and be the brightest light. You remember us talking about that during the Sermon on the Mount, I'm sure. They also came together for moments of refreshment, both physical, and we'll kind of get there here in just moments, but also spiritual refreshment. They came for times of discussion, and they came for times of examination. And they absolutely came together to share the joys of their adventures and to shoulder one another's sorrows and sadness of the full human experience. And the Apostle Paul captures this very practice in his letter to the Romans. In Romans 12:15, he says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn." We've already done that here today, haven't we? It's a very real thing. We experience these highs and these lows, and we do it together, and we should continue doing this together. Just this week, only a few of you probably knew, because the amazing thing of technology is that even if I'm out of town, you can still get a hold of me. So I had an opportunity to leave really early Tuesday and come home really late Friday on a trip down to Nashville. I was invited into, it's called the Chapter 4 Institute, kind of a task force of sorts through our national office of the Church of God. And we're talking about community engagement and what's just missing. Why are many of our churches collectively are struggling with community involvement, the way that certainly the early church would demonstrate. That's really why Constantine, by the 4th century, wanted to co-opt this thing for the state religion. Christians live differently. But anyway, I got to go down to Nashville, and during this gathering, and it's all like pastors. And I assume that pastors, like colleagues, if you were doctors or nurses or whatever your profession is, you get together with other folks, and there's a lot of just sharing. And it's sharing some of the successes and the excitement, and it was palpable. And then the other piece of that is you share some of the struggles. But during that time, what's amazing, that even in the sharing of the challenges, and there were some folks coming with some really heavy things going on even personally, just some real challenges, it was still a very encouraging and uplifting time because we were committed to being with one another. And as we discussed last week, you remember I asked each of us to commit to gathering, and then also to commit to encourage someone every day. And I hope that some of you have had an opportunity to really think about that, and then not just think about it, to act on that. Because folks, our neighborhoods that we live in, our neighbors, us here, each one of us, we need that kind of commitment to encouragement and to being together and to experiencing community via love and care. We need connection regularly. Now, the early church was also committed to what gets called here breaking bread. We're going to discuss that more towards the topic of communion, because for them, communion was incredibly important, and for us it is too. And here's why the early church was stubbornly devoted to breaking bread together. And this is again from the Apostle Paul out of 1 Corinthians. You can follow along here. Familiar text. He said this: "The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and he said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup,'" that would be weird to do that, "'you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" So ultimately, when we think of breaking bread, think of communion, these early church folks, and us too, they were devoted to communion because it's all about remembering Jesus. Jim Lyon, our national director of the Church of God, would say Jesus is the subject. Maybe that's familiar to you guys, maybe it's not. But Jesus is the subject, and we remember Jesus, we remember his life and his willingness to go the way of the cross, his body that was broken for all of humanity, and his blood, which is the marker of the new, the most real covenant between a creator and his creation. We remember Jesus' death, and then his conquering death forever through resurrection, and his promise to return again and make things new. See, these are the kind of realities that we don't just simply pass by quickly. We don't overlook as believers. And because communion is implicitly done with others, it follows that we celebrate and we experience Jesus Christ together. And we do this because I want to remind you the experience part. Jesus isn't a doctrine. Sometimes we treat it like, yeah, it's this thing we kind of believe and we shelve it over here. It's a doctrine. See, Jesus Christ isn't an abstract idea that you just simply believe in with your thought and with your theories. Oswald Chambers would say it this way, you'll see it here on the screen, that Christianity is not devotion to work or to a cause or a doctrine, but devotion to a person, the Lord Jesus Christ. You see, to really know Jesus is to meet him as a person, as the most real experience of love, and we are being invited into a rhythm of continual encounter of Jesus and his Spirit. See, being able to just, put the love of Jesus into theological words and statements, which, I just got done hanging out with pastors. Pastors love to do that. But just putting it into these statements and words, it isn't as important as our actual familiarity with it. True experiencing of Jesus. This is the amazing part, right? Because that's why you can have an experience with Jesus that I don't experience. But guess what? We still get to experience Jesus together. It's not just you have to list these facts about him and believe this doctrine and you're good to go. You get to actually experience it. You experience the love personified. Because the beauty of a desire to encounter Jesus Christ is not that you find perfection in what you believe and say. It's actually about developing and then growing from the outward, inward to the outward, from what you have been experiencing. All in order to bring love and to bring goodness to the world around us. This is the stuff we've been talking about all through the Sermon on the Mount. See, this is the rhythm that we need to live of encountering Jesus Christ via what I would call a living connection to him. And this is what Jesus was always getting at when he used those parables. There were all these agricultural things, right? Jesus uses this. And it's so exciting to me when we start to see it. He says things like, it's like a seed that's planted into some good, rich soil. Living connection to Christ. And it sprouts from there. It's like a branch that's connected to the true vine. So then it begins to bear much good fruit. Communion and breaking bread, folks, it's a connection to the heartbeat of Jesus. It is remembering that he is at the center of all this. Yeah, it's okay. Think about it like this. Our communion is our common union. It's the thing that it brings believers together all around the world, and it's done that throughout history, and it still does it, and it's Jesus Christ is our common union, this living connection to him. And when we do that, when we continue to experience Christ, when we encounter him, maybe in this space, maybe it's on a walk out around the trail because nature is blossoming around us, but when you experience and you encounter Christ, we actually become the incarnate community. We begin to embody the life and the love of Jesus. I wish I could tell you that you could just believe things, merely intellectual assent, and have real life. But folks, it's only through experience and encounter of the living and breathing, real person of Jesus Christ that you actually start to develop this rhythm of being the incarnate community. It's not something we can just manufacture on our own. Now, the last thing that we discussed is these 4 rhythms here of the early church was prayer. And simply put, prayer is an exchange where we make our requests known to God, and God receives them. And we could do an entire series on prayer, and maybe someday we will. And Brenda, just back in February, if you were here for that or check that out online, she did a great job discussing the Lord's Prayer. So I'm going to try to keep this section brief. That's a little bit like ha ha ha, because I always elaborate. But the reality is, it's a gift to pray with others in a gathering. There's power when we pray together, when we gather for that, when we come together as a community and we make our requests known to God. And in fact, when asked for advice on prayer, I want to remind you that Jesus, what he has to say about this in Matthew chapter 6, which is out of the Sermon on the Mount. So you can follow along right here. It's verses 9 through 13. This is what Jesus says when asked for advice on prayer. He says, "This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Now, it's easy to just glance over that because we are very familiar with the Lord's Prayer. But did you notice that Jesus never instructs us here to pray using personal pronouns like my and me? But he instead uses plural pronouns like our and us. Folks, the most famous prayer of all time is a communal prayer. And if not meant to be spoken aloud in the midst of fellowship, which that's common, it is certainly meant to be spoken with the community of believers in mind. See, prayer is a mutual expression. And the truth is, for me, that's so encouraging because I'm assuming that as we walk through this, I've already owned it this morning. Like, I'm almost 38. I've experienced a good amount of life already, and there's more to come, hopefully. But folks, there are times where I struggle where I just can't believe it. And I imagine you're there too. I feel like I just can't see it. I don't see the path. I don't see where this is going. I feel like I've come to the end of my rope. I just can't deal with things any longer, it feels like. You're broken. And the amazing part about this mutual expression is that means there are others that can stand beside me, can stand beside you, and be the ones to encourage and to express what you just can't express and to trust when you cannot trust. For those of you here who have experienced that, you know it. If you haven't fully given yourself over into a community expression of faith and trust, come on in. Because there is power when we pray with one another. Because we are committed to praying together when we come together. Now, as we wrap up and we get towards the end of this, but we got a little ways to go, so hang in there. I know. Sometimes this gets long. I promise you, I try to be very short and sweet, and it ends up like this each week. So, sorry, but it's just what it is. So, but you're here, so that's good news. You must be okay. But as we wrap up today, I just want to revisit really quickly something that we discussed last week. We discussed that in Hebrews 10:25, where we talks about how some people have developed a habit, is the word used there, of not meeting together. Specifically, it said this. It says, "Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing." But folks, that's not us, right? You're here. You're online. We're not giving up that habit because we are committed to gathering together because it's who we are, right? As the family of God, it is who we are. And this is what we do. We learn together. We remember Jesus together. We fellowship. We're really good at that, aren't we? Together. And when we get together, we pray together. And so in order to give you just a little bit of something here, I wanted to, let us see what the early church was doing in that rhythm that becomes habit and they're being together. And so the reality is here, a healthy rhythm forms healthy habits. And habits are, as we already talked at the beginning of the message with that long quote, habits are powerful in shaping our lives. So I want us to consider one actionable step. And there's going to be a little discussion here as we go, but we're towards the end. I want us to take inventory of your rhythms and your habits. Now that's exhausting, right? That sounds like a lot of work right there because there's a lot going on with that. But I want us to consider and really examine our good and maybe even what we would call our more negative habits. Because we naturally do better when we acknowledge and when we celebrate our good ones and when we do the work to redirect some of those undesirable habits into something more desirable. So I want to look at a few just negative habits that often, at least in church life, I don't know what other word to, it sounds churchy, but I've grown up in church my entire life. And I think these are the things that get in the way often of our spiritual health or our spiritual development going further. And the first one here you'll see is comparison and judgmentalism. We talked about some critical nature not that long ago, but we could call this just being hypercritical. And we know, because if you encounter the Bible, you're going to encounter the religious elite in Jesus' day. Okay, and even some of our folks in our day, we like to fancy ourselves as the gatekeepers. Okay, kind of as a way of distinguishing us or separating us from the rest of society. I've said it this way, it makes you feel all comfy and cozy when you're up on Morality Mountain looking down on all those poor old villagers down in the valley, right? So we struggle with this. This is a bad habit. Comparison, judgmentalism. So I want to offer you, when you think about this, a new rhythm. A new rhythm is that when you see a need, fill it. When you see someone struggling with handling life, please lean in and see where you can be a help. Why? You might ask, well, that's because that's work. Why would I do this? Because you are never more loving, than when you are ministering to someone else, especially out of a genuine care, because you've probably experienced many of the same things of life's challenges and pains, and you can be the support they need. That's what Jesus did. When we talk about compassion, it's co-suffering. To come alongside someone that you know, I've experienced this too, and to just be there for them. Because when you put others first and you play a role in touching someone else's life, no matter how small, you actually are exhibiting the Christ-likeness that can help you break the habit of being consumed with being number one, being consumed with yourself. So that's a new rhythm for how we can begin to really work towards breaking a negative habit and turning that towards a positive. Another habit that I think we struggle with in church, these are all my personal habits, by the way, so I hope that we have some commonality, but these are mine. Laziness. And I put learning in there. We've already talked about it a little bit, but we all enjoy what comes easy to us, right? That's the fun stuff. And what comes easy to us is almost always what we already know. In my house right now, I'm thankful for Kristen handling a lot of homework with Henry because the math has changed, as many of us know. And there's some things that it's not how it works. So I'm trying to convince myself I need to learn some new things like that. But what comes easiest to us is always what we already know. And when we never want to lean into learning new things or learning new approaches, it's easy to get lazy. And guess what? Our spiritual lives are no different. It's easy for us to hit the metaphorical snooze button on our spiritual alarms and convince ourselves that we can just make up for it later in the day or maybe later in the week or, I don't know, all of a sudden maybe later in years to come. Hitting that snooze button. So a new rhythm is this. A new rhythm to help us with our laziness of not wanting to learn. Ain't doing no learning, says Henry. Is we commit to the habit of spending just 10 minutes a day. Think about just 10 minutes a day, maybe in a new devotional book for those who are looking for that kind of content. Maybe it's listening to a new podcast, if you're a podcast junkie, I am, from a different voice or a different perspective, someone who didn't grow up in Greenville, Michigan. How about that? Maybe it's reading from a book from an author that you know has a different perspective than yours. And better yet than all of that, because that's all like content. This is the best. How about you take 10 minutes a day to practice listening to a family member, a coworker, a friend? One step further, how about someone that you don't like? How about a foe? How about you listen to them talk about something that you don't know much about? I know we're all thinking, right, that, I don't have time for something more, and that's why I even put a time thing on it. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I can give you suggestions if you need them. But I know that, this falls outside of our normal routine, the rhythms and habits that we've fallen into. But I want you to consider how something that is a bit different than your regular can then lead you into a deeper prompting from God's Spirit in your head and in your heart. Because I bet you will be surprised, because I've been surprised at just how heart expanding and God revealing it is to become a lifelong learner that doesn't just fall into the same old rut. And then one last one here of a bad habit that I think we often fall into is indifference. And I wonder, and you've got to ask yourself this, so you have to be a little self-aware, would any of your friends or your family call you a grumbler? Would any of your friends or family, people that know you and hang out with you a lot, would they call you a grumbler? I mean, many of us seem to almost think that grumbling is like a basic requirement. I see some fingers being pointed in the back of the room. I'm not going to name names. I think there's a lot of us, folks, we seem to think that grumbling is like a basic requirement of being human. Almost like that it's weird if you feel satisfied and happy. Like that's like you're selling out. You're faking it. And maybe you're there. And it's okay if you own it that you're a grumbler. Yeah. And maybe you find that you complain. Maybe we call it whining. Exponentially more than you find satisfaction in things of And if so, it's a good time to change that habit. And so a new rhythm is this, and this is so basic, but it needs repeating. We give thanks to God for all the small things. Which, if you think of Blink-182, then you're my kind of person. When you say all the small things, I know a few people will. But we give thanks to God for all the small things because, as a rule, the more we share our thankfulness with God, the less we complain. The more grateful we are, the more we find to be grateful for. I mean, it really is as simple as that sometimes. Because it's just really hard to grumble while giving thanks to God for His goodness. It is difficult to gripe and complain while admiring the way that you are provided for. See, the habit of praising God consistently takes our focus off of what we don't like, and it puts our focus on what we do enjoy. And this actually begins to develop in us a grateful and a more thoughtful spirit. So my last things here, because those are just a few habits that I think it's really easy to fall into with a new rhythm. But what these new rhythms are really going to lead us towards is this. These become the habits. I just want to hit these really fast here, and we're wrapping up. Because rhythms lead us towards habit. They help us become who we are and what we do. And the first one is we have to move into a slower pace. That one gives me the heebie-jeebies because I like to be on the move. I drove all the way to Nashville and back, and I loved every minute of that because I like moving. Like literally moving down the road. I was not in a rush, but I found myself feeling in a rush. Like I just got to get around all these vehicles and I got to get there. I like to be out in front, all that clear air. But I'm going to tell you what I have discovered, and the book study groups have heard this all this past year. During COVID, I've learned to move into a slower pace. Some of that was out of necessity. But we have to do that, folks. We've got to take the foot off the gas, metaphorically, maybe literally. And we've got to move into a slower pace. Another one is we have to begin to choose silence. We have to silence the noise around us because that provides time for a bit of self-reflection and self-examination. It allows space for God to speak to you. Now, I already mentioned it, but maybe that just looks like a nature walk. I know some of you just like to get outside. That's a good place to start. Now, you're going to have some birds chirping, which is kind of pleasant, actually. You're going to have some noise and hum of the woods. But we've got to do that work. We've got to choose some silence. The car rides without music, without audiobooks, which is my issue, without the news on the radio. Begin to choose silence. Next one is invest in a real relationship. See, we have to invest in a real relationship with someone who can provide some extra, what I call mirroring, but is self-awareness for you. To help us grow, to help us deal with what we got going on. And this person should be someone who is full of the love of God. Someone that you know is very honest. They are authentic. They are living it. Someone that you know cares deeply for other people, and they have a positive impact on others. But we have to do this. We have to invest in real relationships with others. And then last one, and we talked about this last week, but we have to be a blessing to someone else. We have to be encouragers. See, the habit of looking for ways to make a difference in someone's life not only brings them joy, but as we've talked about, there's a reciprocal nature to this, that it brings you joy as well. And the cool part is, that is a God-honoring thing to do, and it'll even help you take your mind off your own difficulties. This has been a long discussion, starting with the early church and moving into maybe what's more practical here in the year 2021. But as we've already discussed, right, gathering together, breaking bread, fellowshipping, prayer, it's what we do, and then out of here develops rhythms that lead into more habits. But it all starts with we have to take inventory of what are our habits and rhythms, because it's easy just to keep doing the same thing, hoping for a different result. As part of being together, I want us to dismiss today by doing something together. And so I'm going to invite you to stand. We're going to simply say the Lord's Prayer together. Because we gather here for a purpose, right? For many things, but Jesus is at the heart of it. And this is a prayer that he taught his followers. And so Pat will have it up on the screen with us, because everyone's got slightly different language depending on when and where you grew up. But let's say this together. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.